Good evening, everyone. I'll go ahead and call the Committee of the Whole to order. Apologize, I'm having a little bit of mouse trouble, so my screen's not where I'm looking. I'll see if I can get that sorted out. But we just have one item on the agenda tonight, and that is a legislative recap from Doug Levy. So I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Council President and council members. I'm glad to be in front of you this evening to do a report back on what was a very successful 2022 session of the Washington State Legislature for us, and I'm going to be tag teaming with Judith tonight to go through the PowerPoint that hopefully everyone can see on your screens. Judith, next slide, please.
Recording in progress.
So the first thing I'll say is, we went into the 2022 session thinking, hey, that virtual 2021 session was a one-timer, and we'd get back into the notion of in-person sessions of the legislature. For the most part, that was an incorrect assumption. I would call this a mostly virtual 2022 session of the legislature. So, just to give you a context, and obviously a 60-day short session of the legislature, there are always the shorter sessions in even-numbered years, and that also means things like supplemental budgets instead of full two-year budgets. One of the things that characterized the session was an almost unprecedented growth in operating budget revenue to the state of Washington. Ironically, as we went into the pandemic, the thought was that there was going to be a several $billion-dollar hit on the negative side to the state's budget. And what we've seen in the last 2 years, especially spurred by the boom in revenue for tech industries and online retailers and the like, and what you heard from Carrie at your retreat about sales tax, significant spikes up in sales tax, real estate excise tax, marijuana excise tax, some of the things that really drive the state budget, to the point where our legislators had about $12 billion more available to them than they would have thought for the 4-year 21-23 and 2023-25 budget cycles. And a big point of debate was whether the state should reinvest a lot of those dollars or create across-the-board tax relief. And depending on your vantage point there, that was either a session that did well in investing or didn't do well in across-the-board tax relief. Several major initiatives that I'll point to. First of all, I'll let you know that overall, this legislature was very activist. They passed 303 bills to the governor. That's almost the same number you'd see in a longer 105-day session. He partially vetoed a dozen of them. He vetoed another half dozen of them. Nothing that really affects us directly as cities. A significant step forward on the transportation front, the legislature enacted what's called the Move Ahead Washington package, a very different type of package than we normally have seen in transportation revenue in the past. I'll get into that later. Over $500 million worth of new investments in affordable housing and combating homelessness. Just to give you a sense of where that went, $113 million in additional monies into the Housing Trust Fund, $210 million into rapid rehousing, things like purchasing of hotels and properties that can be turned into permanent supportive housing and shelters, $45 million in additional money for rental assistance and preventing evictions, $52 million to assist folks in encampments, particularly within state rights-of-way, get into housing and services. So a lot of focus in that whole issue area. A lot of controversy going into the 2022 session about what was called the Washington Trust, a new tax on citizens and businesses for long-term care. Very controversial because a lot of complaints about the fact that people couldn't get alternative private insurance. It looked like they were still going to pay if they put in for a couple of years and then retired and wouldn't get any benefit. You had folks who may have paid tax in the state of Washington, but then moved elsewhere. So due to a lot of outcry over that long-term care trust, the legislature enacted two bills very early on, one to create an 18-month hold on the whole program and another one to create more exemptions within the program. I'd say another major theme of the 2022 session was gun safety. Two major bills that I highlighted here in your PowerPoint. Senate Bill 5078 puts a new ban on the import, possession, sale of high-capacity magazines, and House Bill 1630 prohibits the open carry of weapons in any public places, including places like city council meetings and county council meetings. Another important area of the 2022 session, some important clarifications of some of the 2021 policing reform bills. I'll get into that more in a moment. And then a wide variety of climate bills. I didn't list them here, but tax incentives for clean tech manufacturing, increased energy efficiency requirements for state buildings, pushing more communities to get into composting and organic food waste, and expanding access to solar power usage. So next slide, please, Judith. So on a big picture basis for, getting into our world, cities and local governments, the operating budget, obviously with the state revenue in a very good place, did a good job of protecting our state shared revenues. I'll get into this more later in the presentation, but a little bit of a bump up in marijuana excise tax distributions to cities and counties, about $5.2 million additionally. Good results on funding public safety, not only the basic law enforcement academy that we pay a lot of attention to, but things like wellness grants for police officers, training money for some of the new law enforcement bills, about an additional $21 million to cities for carrying out the legislation related to the Blake case that Chief Schultz briefed you on extensively during your council retreat. And then on the growth management side, two major ones I'll mention, an additional $10 million in growth management grants overall and for carrying out the House Bill 1220 legislation of last session, and $7.5 million in incentive grants for cities and jurisdictions that want to do more missing middle zoning, and I'll talk more about that in a bill that failed. And then I mentioned utility assistance. The legislature's budget includes $100 million for public and private utilities to help with assistance for low-income ratepayers who have fallen behind, others who have had trouble making their utility payments. I mentioned the clarifications to policing reform bills, and talking about the transportation package for a moment, I'll get into more of the meat of this, but Move Ahead Washington does a very good job of finishing out funding for major corridors like 405, significant new funding for transit and bicycle pedestrian needs. But I want you to be aware of the fact that in some of the final balancing of how to pay for this, there was some diversion of money from the Public Works Trust Fund. And that's why if you've read any of the Association of Washington Cities material, you'll see them express some disappointment over diversion of those dollars. And there really wasn't a lot of direct help for local maintenance and operations needs. So certainly I was listening to you all talk during the retreat about transportation needs and whether you might want to look in the future at something like a transportation benefit district. What I would tell you is there's not a lot of additional money coming directly for your local M&O and street needs. So something to consider. There was a robust supplemental capital budget. Usually, as I mentioned at the outset, a short session would mean a very minimal capital budget. In this case, the legislature decided to transfer $650 million from the operating budget to the capital budget to bolster it. And a lot of that went into some of the housing numbers I cited earlier. And I gave you the numbers for affordable housing and rental assistance. And then, what I always tell the council is you go into these sessions looking to get some gains, but you also don't want to go backwards and get hit on the side of the head with bills that are really problematic for jurisdictions. We really avoided any truly bad bills. There were a couple of very prescriptive ones in the housing and density arena on prescribing missing middle zoning across all single family lots. That was House Bill 1782. And then another one on accessory dwelling units. That was House Bill 1660. And again, we thought overly prescriptive in telling you what you should do, even to the point of prohibiting over time owner occupancy provisions, which Renton has in its ADU ordinance. So it was a little ironic that Renton, as a city doing a lot of work in these areas, was expressing concerns about these bills, but it was more over the way they were put together than the what was in them. Next slide, please. So you never get through a session and say everything's in terrific shape, just to give you a sense of ongoing concerns. We're noticing a trend in the last couple of sessions where legislators who want to see progress in areas like housing density have tended in some cases to want to mandate some things and prescribe some things. And that is always going to be a point of tension with local governments, which would rather see that done flexibly at the state level and honor your ability to have discretion at the local level. While we didn't see any backsliding on revenues and state shared revenues, the legislature hasn't shown a great willingness to give you broad-based new revenue tools or revenue relief. Things like fixing the 1% property tax limit that really puts you in a bind because you see costs go up on the inflationary side and your revenues are limited to 1%. Again, no serious consideration of fixing that problem. And then we were very bullish on a housing benefit district bill, House Bill 1880. That did not get to the finish line. I'll talk about that more later. And then, as I shared in the transportation package, some very good investments, but more of a proclivity to help with state infrastructure and state M&O than on the local side. And then I put a link in here for you if you want to see, on a global basis, the Association of Washington Cities lists of legislative priorities and what they saw as the pros and the cons. You can link to that website right there and get a sense of that. Next slide, please. So then, getting a little parochial and selfish about ourselves, I wanted to give you a sense of how Renton did in the 2022 session, which really went well for us. And what I tried to do is give you a little star if something went our way, and an empty circle on a couple of those that were not so much. But running through these in order of the way we listed them in our agenda and reported to you on a weekly basis, our quality of life request was on the capital budget side. We saw a real timely opportunity to get in to the 405 44th area, as the state is already opening up the right-of-way and the area on each side of 405 44th for the Renton to Bellevue project. Our request was for $250,000 to help us get a May Creek Trail connection and a boardwalk put together, and that was in the final capital budget. So that was great, and we're really excited about that one. It can result in a really cool walking, biking experience between what we hope will be a park and ride lot on one side of 405 and 44th and the new Seahawks station for bus rapid transit on the other side of the freeway. We had, again, a priority plank around racial justice and equity, and really zeroing in on supporting legislation and budget items that we thought could provide very helpful funding and tools to assist in those areas. And I cited a few very good results from the 2022 session. $200 million in the final budget for a community reinvestment grant program. Then a bill we really liked, House Bill 1866, on enabling supportive housing for those that are already under the Medicaid assistance program. and there was about $140 million in combined operating capital money to support that legislation. And then House Bill 1905 was really directing the state agencies to assist those homeless youth that were coming out of a system of care and make sure they had somewhere to go. We had on our list transportation infrastructure and Interstate 405. I think as Councilmember O'Halloran in particular will remember as a member of the executive advisory group to DOT on the 405 corridor, there was some notion that DOT put forward that, because of $450 million in previous pandemic losses from tolling and fuel tax, maybe one of the things they needed to do to make that up was to put some projects along the 405 corridor on hold for many years and just concentrate money on new projects along the 405 managed lanes to make them work better. We and many others had real heartburn with that. You'll see when I get into our projects that not only did the legislature not go there, but they figured out a way to put cash and sales tax deferral money in that'll help construct a project we've been waiting for a long time. And then we wanted to actively support an overall revenue package, as I shared before that happened, through two bills, Senate Bill 5974 and 5975. So substantial investment in the system, although not a lot of new project investment, but 16 years, $16.9 billion, the most the state has ever allocated in a package, even more than they did in the 2015 Connecting Washington. And as I alluded to earlier, the most new money you'll ever see in a transit area or in bicycle and pedestrian investments, along with some new highway investments. Again, I shared with you some of the disappointments that our friends in the Association of Washington Cities had about the diversion of Public Works Trust Fund monies. We've been kind of fortunate to not rely heavily at all on that fund in many years, but it's still disappointing to see it diverted. And then getting into our specific projects, and I'll go into this more on the next page, but the first one we had as a priority was 405 in North 8th. And I want to thank those of you that did a great job in meeting with our legislators and talking about this and then testifying to it. We've been waiting for this project since it was listed in the Sound Transit Sound Move program back in 1996. So $250 million within that $450 million I mentioned is going to go toward designing this in 2025, 27 and building it in 27, 29. So that's a fantastic, successful check the box item. Next page, please. Another one of the specific projects on our list, working with others in the East Rail Coalition, is we were vying for $6 million that could be used to extend the East Rail in Renton. As you all know, it just abruptly ends there near the North Coulon side of Coulon Park. And $6 million will enable getting in and negotiating with Burlington Northern Santa Fe for easement and right-of-way to extend the trail to where South Coulon Park and Southport come together. And just as an add-on, as some of you asked questions during the council retreat about the Sam Chastain Trail, what this $6 million also does is it really positions something like the Sam Chastain Trail for the future, because you'd have an East Rail extension that goes right into that Southport development. And so pretty exciting to think about what could be happening in the future in Renton with making dozens of miles of trail connections for people. On the transportation project side, you see a little circle there. The one that's a bit of a bummer, we had also hoped to see money for an overcrossing of Grady Way, a Grady Way overcrossing of Rainier Avenue that we worked on with DOT as a way to cut down some of the travel times. When Bus Rapid Transit gets built, it'll go along the 405 managed lanes, but at 405 167, it'll have to exit to get to the South Renton Transit Center at Rainier and Grady, and that's a several-minute delay. So this project had been included in some of the 2021 lists. It was not included in the final package here. Again, I think the legislature was really reticent about adding new money for new projects. So this is one I think is so important. We're going to need to continue to look for ways to get it started. I talked about revenue relief and flexibility. All the state shared revenues that come down to our city and others were kept intact or increased, frankly, about $20 million overall if you look at liquor excise tax money and municipal criminal justice, and about a $5.2 million increase I mentioned for marijuana excise tax distributions. That's $20 million statewide to cities, not just to ours. On the public safety side, I mentioned some of the bills dealing with reforms. We were very supportive of many of the 2021 policing reform bills, but on a couple of those regarding defining use of force, we thought there were some unintended consequences, and one of them that I know the chief has talked to in the past was the inability for police to do what are known as Terry stops and apprehend those who were trying to flee a crime scene. House Bill 2037 we thought was very important in addressing that issue, and that passed the legislature. I mentioned 1735. House Bill 1735 also enables police, if they must, to use some level of force to apprehend someone who's in a severe mental health crisis. So that bill was passed overwhelmingly by the legislature, and House Bill 1719 deals with non-lethal use of ammunition, kind of an unintended consequence thing that the legislature agreed it didn't mean to kibosh all sorts of non-lethal ammunition. The one thing I listed here that we were supportive of that didn't quite get all the way through the system, it passed the House but not the Senate in the final week, and that was a bill giving some additional flexibility on vehicle pursuits. As a practical matter, Renton does very few of those, but we did agree with others on clarifications to that statute. It did not happen. As long as I've been representing you all, I think we've had a priority on trying to make sure that the legislature pays for the training it requires local law enforcement to do when new hires are coming on. And the legislature did a very good job on that. They had funding in their budget for 8.5 new academy classes. They had funding to eliminate the waiting line that was building up for classes, and they put a little under $900,000 in the budget so that the Criminal Justice Training Commission can develop an online app so that in the future, officers who can't get physically to the academy could take the training on their phone or on their laptops. And I mentioned there were several other funding streams that were positive on the public safety side. So one other bill that came up short that I alluded to earlier, we really liked this House Bill 1880, and I know some of you did a very good job reinforcing that when we met with our legislative delegation. But it would have enabled a state sales tax credit for transit-oriented development areas that included affordable housing. And in our case, it could have been a real catalyst for something like a purchase of the DOT-owned park and ride lot next to where the BRT station is going in. And so we saw that as a great bill. It moved very well out of its House committee. It died in the House Finance Committee. So that was unfortunate. I think that one will come back again in 2023. Next slide, please. And I want to just take a pause to say thank you, because you have me as sort of your boots on the ground in Olympia, or boots on the Zoom, as it were. And that's all well and good, but this stuff doesn't get done. This isn't a solo practice. We spent months putting together a legislative agenda, meeting with our legislators beforehand. The mayor attended many meetings and did a lot of testimony. All of you were great about doing our virtual day in Olympia. Mr. Council President and Councilmember Perez were in front of committees on several bills giving testimony, so that really helps the cause. And I don't get into, in these types of reports, singling out lawmakers, but I can very earnestly tell you that the members from all of the legislative districts that touch Renton, the 11th, the 37th, the 41st, the 33rd, and the 5th, those members assisted us in some way on many of the things I've talked about. And so for that very reason, we worked with Mayor Pavone on a series of thank you letters, because the legislators are very used to getting the criticism and the hits, but sometimes it's good to come back and say thank you. And I also don't want to forget the staff who, they review bills, they put up with my non-stop emails, and we had staff like Katie Buckley-Morales from CED. I think I butchered the pronunciation of her name, but she was great about testifying in front of one of the committees on the ADU bill I mentioned earlier. So just a real shout out to all of them. So thank you. Next slide, please. I want to give you a sense of what's ahead, some of which is written here, some of which I'll add. First of all, redistricting kicks into place in 2023. So, the legislature gets the new census numbers. They set up a redistricting commission. As you may remember, that commission set up a series of new legislative district and congressional district boundaries, not without a fair amount of controversy. But legislators will have to campaign in the fall of 2022 for the new district boundaries that will take effect in 2023. For us, that means a very heavy portion of Renton is now in the 11th district. A little sliver of the community is in the 5th, and that's it. I mean, we used to, as you can see from my earlier slides, touch 5 districts. Now we'll be, heavily touching one and very slightly touching another, and that'll start next year. I should add, too, that, there will be a lot of very competitive campaigns in the fall in these off-presidential year elections. The makeup of the legislature can and often does change. Also, a note for all of you that there are some important retirements in the legislature. The House Majority Leader, Pat Sullivan from the 47th District, is not running for re-election. Kirsten Harris-Talley from the 37th District that, up until next year will have had Renton and downtown Renton. She is not running. And Representative Jesse Johnson from the 30th District, not too far down the way from us, is not running. So you'll see some of those changes as a result of members choosing not to run for re-elections. And then, as we sort of sift and sort internally, some funding opportunities and tools through capital budget and Move Ahead Washington that we're going to evaluate and talk to the staff about. And I want to let you know that as we speak, we're working on some federal funding submittals through Senators Cantwell and Murray and Congressman Smith's office. And then, within the next few weeks, by early May, you will have from me a very comprehensive report on the session where I go at length in terms of overviewing how we did and giving you a sense of bills that didn't pass and underscoring some key things you need to be sure to implement, funding opportunities you should be aware of, and the like. So that's a very quick overview and report of how things came out this session. I am more than happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Doug. Good report as always. We can do questions. We have about 15 minutes of scheduled time available. Any questions for Doug? All right, well, I'll jump in with a question, and that's going to be on Move Ahead Washington. So I've heard from a couple folks that, yes, even though it was a, quote, mini package that wasn't mini at all, there still is an appetite for more next year, potentially. And obviously, see how the elections go, see, what gas prices or what potential revenue sources might be doing at that time. A lot can happen between now and then, but how can we position ourselves for some of those carryovers? And what do you see as our top priorities? That obviously the Grady Way overpass would be, I'm assuming, top of our list coming back. Were there any other things that came out of the session that we should be taking advantage of that would be setting us up for a successful 23?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mr. President. Yeah, I think, first of all, the key legislative about it, but I think they made clear that this package, which, as you very well said, is a mini package that kind of maxed out, but it did not include a new gas tax. That is almost unprecedented. And legislators who put together the package were very clear in saying, look, we're probably going to have to come back in another 2-3 years and try and get at some of the new and additional investment needs we didn't get to in this package. So for Renton, yes, I absolutely agree that area around 405 and 167 and connecting up with BRT, we intend to work with Representative Hackney, among others, to get the House Transportation Chair here to maybe get a visual of why that's so important to us. And there is some ability in the grant programs. There's going to be more money for some of the bicycle and pedestrian and safe routes to schools programs. So on your question about what we in Renton can do, the council has been very vocal, for example, on the sidewalk deficit in certain parts of Renton. And so where can we take some of those deficits and pair them up with new grant opportunities that we can take advantage of? That's, I think, part of our work product over the next few months.
Okay, I have one other question. I'm not seeing any other hands jumping in, so I'll ask that, and then we might be able to, unless I spark a question from someone else, adjourn a little early. And that was on the housing benefit districts. Obviously, we would like to see that get through. Any ideas? Was there an issue with the bill itself? Or was it just the clock running out on us on that one? What could be tweaked to make that more successful in next session? Was it too small in scope, only having a couple cities, so that there wasn't enough buy-in from coalition supporters to get it to rise to the attention? And if so, would that help, something like that help at next session? What can we tweak to make sure it gets done, or do we just need more time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. It's a great question. I think it's maybe a combination of a blend of some of what you asked about, Councilmember McKerven. For one thing, the legislature always is careful on state sales tax credits. That's, essentially booking money to go from their budget to someplace locally. So they're always a little cautious about that. I think there was a lot of confusion when the bill was coming up for what they call executive session, and Olympia is a little different than what you call executive session. It's when they get ready to take votes to pass bills out of committee. There were a lot of questions about other tax credit, tax incentive measures that had been passed for housing. We talk about the 1590 money. That's a 1/10 of 1 cent sales tax that we took advantage of for new housing and mental health and the like. There was another one from 2019 called House Bill 1406 that involved a credit against the state sales tax. So there were a lot of questions about, okay, how's this one different than some of the others we've done, and what does it do that we didn't get at before? And I think there were good answers to those questions, but sometimes you get to that point in the session where everything's coming at them at once, and if they don't have absolute clarity, they don't go there. Your question on the number of jurisdictions to sort of bring in on that bill is always an art versus a science. There were only 4 jurisdictions that would have qualified for the state sales tax credit, kind of those that were well along in their TOD efforts like us. Could you bring in more cities like a Kirkland or a Seattle? You could. Obviously, that jacks up the amount of the state sales tax credit. So it's that calibration that's going to be, I think, retested going into 2023.
Thank you. All right, last call for questions before I will go ahead and adjourn us. And a quick note I should have said at the beginning, Councilmember O'Halloran was having power issues, so so she is planning on joining us for the full council meeting. Just wanted to make sure to save that battery. And then Councilmember Perez is still out on a family business. So just for members' information. And I think we're at the end. Doug, thank you so much. Appreciate the report. And we'll see everyone back here at 7 o'clock for the full council meeting.
Thanks so much.
All right, thanks. We're adjourned.